Hey, fellow G&Ters, those of us like our spirituality with a twist. So we are doing something I don't know, Daniel, I see is very quintessentially G&T. We are going to do our very best to give kind of a history of Christianity. Um, and this is us putting a sort of more of our kind of educational podcast hats on, right?
Mhm.
Kind of have different hats we put on at different times. And this is the hat we're going to wear now. We got to this as part of what was like kind of our 2025 project, America, what the hell? And we've tried to give different perspectives, different aspects of what has gone wrong with the United States, how things have gone so crazy, and how that affects us both collectively and individually. And part of this, I think, has to be the acknowledgement, and it's not an easy acknowledgement that America has a kind of a Christianity problem. And we did one other episode on this, and we're going to continue on with this, but in our spirit and our style, try to make it educational at the same time, right? So we're not just sitting here just I don't know, whatever you would call it. Just talking smack. We wanted to make it educational too.
Yeah.
So, uh, just the acknowledgement that a major part of the problem of how we've gotten where we are is there's this sort of toxic version of Christianity. That's not to say that all versions of Christianity are toxic, but there are toxic versions of Christianity, and we got kind of an authoritarian one that's here, and it's has nasty qualities to it. So, as an educational podcast, like we talked about, we're going to try to do something about just looking at like what really Christianity is about. But before we get into all that, if you could do all the things that people ask you to do, right? Like, subscribe, you can share the video with people, you can give a little feedback on the videos or on wherever you're listening to. That's awesome. It helps us out a lot. Again, we're trying to go to meaningful places in a kind of a really toxic and polarizing time. And there you go. To me, like when I think about why this matters, and this has come up in a lot of the conversations we had over the past year. Some of this is collective, like the fact that there is this toxicity problem. And I just did a little bit of like quick research on it. And we have like 80% of the people who support the authoritarian kind of things going on in the country are like identify as Christian. So you're like, well, what does that even mean? And then there are people obviously in the government themselves who kind of identify this way. And so that's a problem. And then the other part that strikes me, Daniel, and I don't know what you think about this, and on an individual level, we live in like a deeply kind of Christian culture. And whether we're Christian or not, we're living in the milieu of like Christianity. So I think this stuff is really important to think about what Christianity really means to my mind. And I feel like there should really be this kind of educational project should be part of what people learn, but we really don't. So, but to understand what this is really all about, I think is really kind of a good thing.
Mm.
Plus, on the other hand, I feel like it's just an amazing story to try to understand, right? It's such
Mhm.
a deep part of our cultural history. And so we'll try to do our part and maybe doing something a little educational around this. And it's strange for me, but like I was talking with someone about this and I was like, this is such an important subject to understand.
Mhm.
But I don't know, uh, we don't get the opportunity to really do it. So that's my opinion on that. You got opinions on that?
Yeah, the importance that we do not place on something shows, in my opinion, because I'm a bit of a conspiracy theorist, just a little bit, the level to which the powers that be would prefer you not to know about that particular thing.
Yeah. Hmm.
And so when it comes to this in particular, while I am what do they call that? Sectarian, in my views about separation of church and state, which is, surprising what this country was founded on. So strange, I'm aligned with those people.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but that, like, because of that, though, the downside is that the only place in which you learn about religion at all until you get to college, basically, when you take a world religions course, which I don't know about you, Eric, but anytime I've talked to anybody, people love that class and they've learned so much in a world religions class, you know?
You start to understand why the world is the way it is. It gives you real
Yeah,
insight into why things tick the way they do, right? Yeah,
absolutely.
totally agree.
And so because we are sectarian, rightfully so, and I believe we should be even more sectarian than we are, but okay, that we don't take the critical lens to religion until most of your opinions are probably formed about any of the religions.
Oh, I see what you mean. You already have something already established before you get
Correct.
the chance to really look at things through a more thoughtful lens.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's true.
And that is a problem. That is a problem because you are not able to hold an open mind to something. The concepts that you have on things are generally going to be polarized. So if were young and impressionable and you were paying it, like just listening as a young kid after 9/11, boom, you're not into Muslims,
Yeah,
not at all.
you're gonna have that
Done.
sense. Yeah.
Islam,
Mhm.
get it out. Out. Who cares? Because that's the only that's the sensationalistic view of things is going to make it into the milieu of everybody, right? That's it. It's not the
I think we
good
used
things.
the word milieu twice in this episode.
Oh wow, well, let's do it.
I think I used it too.
I like it.
Drinking game,
Yeah,
milieu.
yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and so that's the unfortunate part. You're only going to get the salacious and downtrodden aspects of any practice or any religion. They're not going to be like, "Wow, look at all these I don't know, theosophical people who are giving to the poor." No, it's going to be like, "These people are a cult," like that's what they're going to hear. And so it's a very puritanical view of religions on the outside, and it makes it very difficult for people to study something because if you're in the thing, you're drinking the Kool-Aid, you're never going to be able to know what it actually tastes like. And as a one layer backing out of that, that is the one of the major goals of this podcast, especially of the last year, but really over the last couple of years, is probably starting with the femininity stuff a couple of years ago, if I'm being honest, is understanding the conditioning. You really have to get a feel for the container for which we are all living in so that you understand what it is that you are being steeped in on a daily basis. And I think once you can kind of understand or at least get a feel for it, then you can make decisions for yourself and say, do I want this influencing me every day? Or do I want to choose something else? And so these conversations that we're having, the research that we do and what we bring forth is brought out of that very specific intent.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And I think there's just a fundamental, like, whether you want to say it's Zen or Taoist or Tantric or whatever you want to say, Sufi, there's just a fundamental idea there, right?
Hmm.
That I think has been the spirit of what we've been trying to do ever since we were in the pandemic and we are like, let's do this,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
As far as that goes, I think what struck me from the last episode is that we wanted to look at this big, and I think it's fair to say, and this is sometimes words help in this way. I was like, okay, yeah, there's like authoritarian paradigms across all the spectrums of all the different religions, you know.
Mm.
Sometimes I'll talk with people and then maybe they, like you were saying, people can be anti-Muslim or something like that for whatever their exposure was, or you can be, I have people I know who are kind of like darker on Christianity than I am.
Sure.
And I'm like, yeah, well, no, there's authoritarian versions of all of these different systems, right?
Hmm.
And if there's one thing I think, based on what you're saying too, if there's one thing that I think what we're trying to do is we're trying to like fight against that, you
Hmm.
know, authoritarian, oppressive, hyper orthodox things, you know, are destructive of spirituality at the core. So we kind of did that in the last episode, and that I thought was helpful for me, right, to think about that. And then you can start to make some distinctions, like, and I think that's important. I was thinking about it from the Chinese medical point of view because they talk about like the small intestine trying to separate what's good and you want to keep from the turbid and what you want to eliminate.
Hmm.
And as I was thinking about our episodes, I was like, well, okay, you know, that's part of what you have to do. You have to get a filtration process going,
Right.
right? And figure out, like, okay, this I want to keep. Let me thoughtfully look at this, which is what you were saying before. You know, I'm going to try to keep this. This, no, this is toxic. I got to flush this down ultimately down the commode. This has to go, you know, talking about the intestines. So, you know, you sort of can think in that way, right? Yeah. The other thing that was the big takeaway for me, and it took a bit in our episodes to talk about it, but you know, one of the things that really I just find amazing is like how for millennia people have been arguing about what the real Christianity is or what the real Jesus is. And I think that's what we're going to try to educate about here, which is that there's never really been like one definitive real person of this, right? This
Correct.
always meant such massively different things to so many people. And I don't know entirely what that means, you know, for different people who might be listening, or for different people's belief systems, people who are listening and people who aren't listening. I wonder about what that means. But you think about how much conflict there's been over like who has the right version of this particular set of ideas or who this
Mhm.
person is. It's kind of amazing, that you
Mhm.
could have so much conflict over that question. And if we could take a step back and really look at it, and we're going to try to do an educational thing about this, you realize from the very beginning, it was just, especially in this particular system, I don't know how it compares to other ones, but especially in Christianity, it's always been like a potpourri of like different people with like radically different views. And you can make out of that whatever you want, I suppose. Again, I think it's troubling that you look at people clashing so violently about this for so long,
Literally.
or people like saying that they are justified in like running roughshod over other people to the present day because of these beliefs, right? It's
Correct.
not the only part of what's happening, but it's a part, right?
It's definitely a part.
What's
Yeah.
happening in the world now. If people had if the group of people who identify, within this faith changed their mind, this couldn't happen, right? So, okay. So that's striking. But maybe on the other hand, as we got to in the last episode towards the end, I was like, there's something potentially liberating about that too, which means that you can kind of go with the version of truth, and if you want to see, let's say in this case, we're talking about Christianity, Jesus is part of your influential spiritual figures, you can kind of have a Jesus that works for you or something. And that was kind of striking at the end of that episode for me,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's kind of a Zen story where someone's asking a Zen master, did the historical Buddha exist or not? And the Zen master, I can't remember if we talked about it last episode, but the Zen master says, well, for the people who need there to be a historical Buddha, there was a historical Buddha. For people who don't need it, there's no Buddha.
Mm-hmm.
But the whole idea that I think for us talking about critical spirituality, if I were to base my whole faith on the idea that there's my vision of Buddha is the right vision of Buddha or something, that's kind of crazy
Right.
on some level because there's so many ways of visualizing or thinking about who that spiritual figure is.
Mm.
So I know I found that to be kind of positive at the end because I was like, it doesn't undermine your ability to have a certain figure as an inspirational force within your life. You can have that and connect to that. It's just this idea that there's some concrete one version of this where if you really try to understand this, there is no one concrete version
Right.
of this person or this set of ideas. So, anyways, you got more on that or
Yeah, well, that's that in essence is the problem, right? Is the one way. And to me, we talk about ego. We talked a little bit about that in the last episode in
yeah,
particular.
that's
We've
true.
talked about it in previous episodes. We have some episodes called egos, then, and I named it the existential guardian operating system.
Yeah,
Uh,
guardian being existential and guardian being operative words there.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. But that, I mean, we could call that what that is here. And that is the defense mechanisms of people's ego wanting to be right, which is literally like the key aspect of your ego is being right, you know, being clearly identified and being the one, the right one, and that as a, and we've talked about this before, especially with society, it's a society is a macrocosm of an individual. And so if the individual has an identity or an issue with identity, the society is going to have an identity or an issue with identity, or if say forget society, let's just say a larger in group, any kind of particular religion. And when you have factions of religions or factions of anything, they want to be the most pure. They want to be the most right. And that brings up a whole lot of like headbutting and then falsification. Because once you dig your heels in, if you admit any I don't know, you show any kind of shakiness to your belief or to your faith or whatever, you're going to A, lose people, and B, people are not going to believe you anymore because they say, oh, well, you were wrong about that. What else are you wrong about? So now you have all these people walking about saying, oh, this is the right way. And the next person, this is the right way. No, this is the right way. No, believe me, those others know nothing. This is the right way. And actually, it's this way in many traditions. Many traditions. I mean, look at go back to Islam, look at the Shia and the Sunni, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
Much violence over this. But from the outside perspective, nobody, not nobody, but many people in the world don't even know those two factions. They just,
I don't think you would know, and I'll be honest because I haven't spent a lot of time with it. If you ask me like totally what the theological differences are, I'd be like, I don't know if I fully even understand them. That would be
Sure.
something I really have to try to understand afresh. I know there's like different lines of transmission that people debate over, but I don't know if I fully get the core of that debate, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
So
So,
I'm
I
just
mean,
saying this aspect of being right and wronging the others to the point of making them enemies, even if you have the basically 90% shared belief. It's the hyper focusing on the differences and the discrepancies that cause, what really are small gaps in teaching or in understanding to become crevasses that are infinitely difficult to pass and therefore create dualism and then enemies and then, you know,
yeah, even interesting
murder and
because like
prosecution.
if you look at like this, people might have radically different points of view on. They might not even be that small. Some of them are small, some of them are big,
Sure.
right? But I, I I just think that okay, then I think we agree this is an important subject matter to just try to talk through this, and it's enlightening to learn like the incredible diversity of this, and then uh, I don't think it undermines your ability to believe in aspects of things, but like I think it's a powerful and fascinating story,
Yeah.
just fascinating as a thing. So, anyways, the other thing we did in last episode, I just remind about, and just because I'm like a diagnostician in my day job, right? We're medical people, we diagnose. I like the idea of sometimes coming up with something quick that you can use as kind of like a little diagnostic tool. So I came up with a what did they just forget that part game, where you take any part of any story that you know about Jesus. And this is not to trash people's beliefs. It's just, it shows something fascinating. And you could kind of take we did the last episode, you take a story like changing water into wine, it's only in one gospel. Sermon on the Mount is only in Matthew, and so on and so forth. Take anything just do a little quick search, and it'll be like, oh, it only appears here, it only appears there, it only appears here. And you can go like, what did they just forget to mention that part game?
Mm-hmm.
This one forgot, or that person forgot, Mark forgot, Luke forgot. No, they're writing different stories because they have different beliefs and different theologies and different things to express. Try the game for yourself. It's just a diagnostic thing. It's kind of mind opening. So
Well,
I'll
and
throw it out to people who might be listening. Just do it. Take any story.
right.
Realize, wow, like they're telling different stories. And that's not even bad. They're telling different stories because they just have different perspectives. They're
Mm-hmm.
trying to share. And they never thought those books, their work was going to be jammed in with these other things. They just have a different vision of what
Mm.
they're trying to communicate. And that's, I think, a lot of what I took away from like understanding the historical context around these things. You're like, okay, yeah, people had different spiritual visions they were trying to express.
Well,
I'm
and
sorry, I
keep
didn't
in
mean to cut you
mind,
off about that, but
no,
yeah.
no, keep in mind, these stories were selected. They were canonized. Others were not. And we have never been able to see other stories. So I, at this point, am in a pretty firm refusal to believe that decisions by man are in reference to this kind of like biblical topic are all influenced directly by the hand of the creator or of God and saying, "Oh no, they decided this, therefore this is exactly how it's supposed to be." People make mistakes. So unless every single person which is literally against the religion because it would take away their savior, they can make mistakes. They can do things out of ignorance. They can do things out of selfishness. They can do things just not so well on one day because they didn't sleep well the night before. I don't know. But there's so many different influences that we have on us that it's impossible to just simply say, well, this is how it is, so this is how it should be. I don't accept that. I'm not accepting that's how it should be. I think, we got to release all the Epstein files.
Yes, yes.
Booyah. And release all of the Jesus files.
Well, the thing that's striking, there's two things that hit me about what you're saying. One is the Jesus files. Release the Jesus files. That would be like a thing. Let's
Release
create a
them.
movement.
Look, I mean, get them out.
Yeah, so what Daniel's referring to in part is there's all kinds of other gospels under different names that never got into this book,
Mm-hmm.
right? But I mean, so there's two parts. I totally agree with that. And that's a fascinating subject, and we'll try to do a little justice to that. But then also that even within the four that we got, they're not telling the same story. And it's very eye-opening, right? That that's the case. As far as people, I never I'm taking this already past the point that we're going to look at these as like divine inspiration in a word by word way. I don't think we're taking that attitude,
No.
obviously, podcast. One of my favorite historians on this, though, has a fascinating story about that because he originally, it's Bart Ehrman, University of North Carolina. I think he just retired. But you can do a search on him, and he has a lot of interesting things on this subject. If this floats your boat, there's more to learn. We'll try to share things, and I draw on some of his work, and he like has a kind of a fascinating story from his own life. He like it's when he was in his teens, he converted to like hardcore evangelicalism, like really hardcore biblical literalism, the whole thing, like as hardcore as you could get. And then he found out that he was really interested in like the sources of where the Gospels came from, the religious books came from, the New Testament came from. So he started trying to get himself educated. He's a passionate person, right? And he also realized he had talent for Greek or something. So he's learning all this stuff. And he started going off to like these very initially really religious schools. There's one in Chicago that he went to, and I'm forgetting the name of it.
Moody?
Moody, Moody Bible Institute. Thank you, Daniel. That's going to be hardcore evangelical, right? But eventually he found his way to Princeton, and he was still an evangelical person, but now he's in a much more challenging academic environment where, it's not Moody Bible Institute anymore, hardcore evangelical conservative world. And he wrote this long paper, and he was trying to come up with an explanation of that's a small thing. Why Jesus said one date over here and one date over here or something, things didn't match. And since he was a biblical literist, he was like, what happened? These two things can't just conflict. And he was trying to write this wrong rationalizing paper for one of his professors at Princeton, who was a religious guy too, but not as hardcore, not as biblical literal. And like he wrote this long thing and he got the paper back, and the guy had given him an A. He said, okay, A. But his only comment was, well, maybe the person who wrote that gospel just made a mistake. And it was like he describes it as his moment of like where his world started to shake,
Mm,
because he was so hardcore into this very specific and very extreme way of being a religious person and a spiritual
mm.
person and whatever. And just that one little comment, well, maybe whoever wrote the Gospel of Matthew just made a mistake of who was emperor at that time or something, and the whole thing started to crumble. So,
Right.
mm, yeah, which shows you, I guess, in a way, if you have that much fragility in your belief, it's going to fall at some point, or you're going to have to get what you were talking about, Daniel, which hit me too. I was teaching a class on psychology for TCM people, and if you get threatening to people, people freak out,
Oh
right?
yeah.
We've done an episode on defense mechanisms. People flip the fuck out,
Mm,
right? And you
mm.
get to these core things where people feel fragile, and you get these very strong psychological reactionary mechanisms that like kick in, right? So all right, well, let's give a tumble. We'll start giving like a little bit of an educational thing to do. We had like kind of two rounds to do with this. I guess we'll probably get to that both of them eventually. But let's take a tumble on just talking about the different views that people had about Jesus, just from a historical perspective, right? And then at some point, maybe we'll look at the different versions of Jesus and gospels that made it and gospels that didn't make it. But going back to like the whole like earliest versions of this, people began to believe like different things almost like right out the gate. So we'll just talk about the different kind of big views that people had, and then maybe we'll focus on things that are a little bit more narrow.
Yeah.
All right. So when people do this, like in a historical context, they tend to say, okay, here's one group of people, here's another group of people, and then here's different people at different interpretations. The first one we can talk about would be a group of people that they called the Ebionites, which mean like the poor or the poor ones. And then this group of followers of Jesus, again, umbrella term for a group of people, but a way of talking about, a big part of the collective that were the original people that were part of the Christian movement. They saw Jesus as like a human messianic prophet. So it wasn't like he was, some special divine figure in the way that Christianity would evolve later. He was more just like a prophet, right? And divinely inspired, but similar to other divinely inspired prophetic figures, right?
Hmm.
Uh, Out of the Judaic tradition. So Ezekiel and Elijah and these other kinds of figures, right? Um, and they preached especially vows of poverty and then kind of non-harm, so like vegetarianism, We just flipped the food pyramid upside down, I guess, so that would like not work.
Mm.
Our food pyramid. I didn't. You paid attention to that at all? I didn't want to go off on it. Oh man, they just totally flipped the food pyramid. JFK or RFK did it, and now it's like steak on the top and
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
We'll save the red meat for the idiots, you know.
Yeah, vegetarianism, poverty, and then kind of renunciation. And they also were people who were rejecting of like we've talked about this a little bit. I know this is a fascinating point for you. They kind of rejected St. Paul, right? Who ran off with a way of looking at Christianity that probably went more to like a Gentile population, right?
Hmm.
And they were more people who said, no, what Jesus' point was that you were going to uphold the law. And this became like a kind of a massive point of conflict. So that's one of our first kind of groups. You got anything on that, Daniel, or should I say a little bit more about it?
No, you go
What
ahead.
I find really interesting about it, I happened to read this book recently called The Name of the Rose.
Mm.
They made a movie of it with like Sean Connery, used to play James Bond. It's kind of an older movie, kind of a great movie if you can get into it. It's like a mystery set in a medieval abbey, and Sean Connery plays this monk who is also like a great detective. He's kind of like a Sherlock Holmes who's a monk, and he's trying to like
Mm.
use rationality. So it's a great movie. You can check it out for yourself. I think it's a young Christian Slater, if that means anything to you as a Gen
Ooh.
X kind of person. Yeah, he's a bigger deal in Gen X world. But
Yeah, no,
anyways,
but that's not our audience for sure.
yeah. Well, Gen X is not. Well, maybe we got some Gen Xers out there. Yeah. Not so many. Well, you can learn the wonders of a young Christian Slater.
Yeah.
He's a decently handsome young man. So this Name of the Rose, what's really fascinating about it is I actually listened to the book of it. You know, it's a great movie. I listened to the book in the past year. I don't have as much time to sit and read. And this poverty question keeps coming up.
Mm.
So I just wanted to throw it out, you know, like to what extent we would have a tradition that would believe in like, you know, simplicity and poverty and vegetarianism and like non-harm, right? And what's wild in The Name of the Rose is that this fight continues on like forever. So the guy who wrote the book is a guy named Umberto Eco. He's an Italian guy who's also like an expert in theology.
Hmm.
And so he embeds the book with all of this stuff. And in the book, there's this incredible fight between the Franciscans, the followers of St. Francis, who are still preaching poverty and simplicity and all these things, you know, they kept that line going, right? That's what the tradition should be about. And they're kind of fighting with like the Benedictines. And I'm not saying I have expertise in either of these orders, but the Benedictines are more like, no, we have to have money and glory and power because that's how we sort of proclaim the church or something like that. And the book is kind of wild because there's this huge fight going on.
Well, Eric,
And
isn't that emblematic of the previous two popes? One
yeah,
literally Pope Benedict, and the next one Pope Francis.
yeah, they're exactly good call. I wasn't thinking about that when
And
they
they're
put us
and
together.
that's exactly their personalities, for
Yeah,
sure.
still going on, right? Fight down to the present day. Like, what is this supposed to be about as a spiritual tradition? I love it, right? Is it
Hmm.
supposed to be about simplicity and what the Ebionite perspective might be more like, yeah, simplicity, poverty, giving away riches, and all this kind of stuff? Or
Hmm.
is it more like accumulating, whatever you want to say, power and authority so that you can, if you want to frame it in the most polite way, you can have more influence or something? That's a
Sure.
good call. Yeah, and they took the names of those two things, right? It's like right there. Yeah, excellent. Yeah. So, anyways, in the Name of the Rose, the other thing that comes up is like you get these divergent things, and often you can like get executed violently over this. So it was a very educational thing for me, and maybe in a way educational for the podcast. I was listening to it a little bit from that point of view too. There's another group who were called Dulcinians, and they ended up like in the crosshairs of like the Inquisition. And they're the more radical group of people. So I wanted to throw them out too because you get that line of Christianity too, right? That is kind of there, and it shows how complicated it is, right? Even in just talking about this, you end up with like, you know, these different people with like radically different perspectives. What's I think fascinating about these Dulcinians, and they were like wiped out, but they were the more radical people. So their idea of Christianity was that it was supposed to be about human liberation from restraint and oppression, from entrenched power, including those that might be accumulating in something like, you know, a church system. They wanted, like, at their time, the fall of the feudal system. and a reinvention of like a new economic system that would be more fair and a new society based on mutual aid, respect, shared property. So something that feels like a little bit more socialist or something like that, right? And especially respecting gender equality too. And it's an interesting part of the book. Like these people get executed, but the founder of this thing, Friar Dulcino, and then one of his other important co-leaders was a woman, Margaret of Trent, who were both killed in the Inquisition. And in the book Name of the Rose, he does describe these events because I think the author's trying to give a feeling like, see how diverse this is, you know? But I think a lot of people, that kind of more Dulcinian view is what they think Christianity is about. What do you think about that?
I think it's probably more the first one.
The simplicity and the poverty and all that.
Hmm.
Yeah. But I mean, don't you think there's a lot of views of Jesus as sort of like a social liberating figure? I mean,
Totally.
it appeals to some people too. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I mean, so in defense of the New Testament, which you're not going to hear me defending it a ton, I believe it was, curated and there was intentionally different stories chosen to highlight different aspects because they're marketing also, right? So they're doing this intentionally. Um, but why I say I feel like it's probably more the first one because that one is the one that is the least sexy. And for
Oh,
me, like the deeply kind of like any spiritual leanings that I have ever had that really touch the heart generally are not really sexy, you know? They're not. And because it's simple. Real wisdom is simplistic. It is often not, it is, like even for people who have very ornate practices, the wisdom and the change that comes from these practices really makes somebody a more clear person. Your understanding becomes more clear. These practices are clarifying. And so I feel like the movement towards simplicity generally, again, just from my experience, is a movement towards actual understanding on a very deep level. You take away the complexities because from a practice standpoint, this is a faith-based tradition. The practice on most of the practice here is on an external in the external world, right? Giving alms and doing community stuff like it's outward driven, and the internal practices generally are prayer and things like this, right? I don't even know the internal practices, and this conversation might be over the heads of some of the audience, but you know generally speaking, you have things that you'll do internally as a part of some kind of overarching spiritual practice, and then you'll have the life that you lead on the outside. And the hope is that the things that you practice work on you in such a way that your outward actions in society are an extension of that. And so I have never pursued, but I have never been given an inkling that there is, and I'm sure there probably is, because there are Christian mystics, that there is like a real deep tradition of mysticism or something like this in the Christian tradition. It doesn't mean they don't exist. I'm just saying I have not run into it myself. I've run into it in Islam, right, with the Sufis. Obviously, I've run into it um, with Tibetan Buddhism, have definitely run into it in Hinduism with through via different yogic practices, definitely run into it in Taoism and the longevity practices and things like this. Um, totally through Zen, totally through some martial arts, that bring your awareness sort of inside and you're working with your chi or your ki, as some traditions will call it. So I have been introduced to internal practice from various other traditions, but I haven't been with Christianity. And I grew up Christian and I went to a Christian college, studied Christianity in school as well as theology in school at a collegiate level. It doesn't make me an expert. However, it means that I've studied it at a level that I had to write papers and
It's hard
look
to
at
say
it
if you've been
critically.
around something your entire life that you don't have like exposed, so I know what it's been
Yeah.
like to be exposed, right?
So
That you do know, right?
that's what I'm
Yeah.
saying. And so because of that, because again, just the appearance to me is an intentional movement towards the external. It's an intentional pushing of people's view to the outside, right? You have your one view on the inside, Christ, done. You're good. You got to figure it out. And then everything else is external. If, again, it's just my interpretation, if I look at it as far more simplistic, far more, we call it meek, right? Far more about giving, far more about clarity, that to me seems what is lacking. That to me, that's I yield back.
So I think like on the mystical side, what we'll eventually get to, because it's part of the group of people who are like, when historians look at this, part of the original groups of people who are following different paths around this, is we'll talk about Gnostics, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's probably where we get to the more mystical strain of this.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll get to those folks, right? I thought like that's probably be our capper because they're the most different than what we're going to be talking about, you know, where you'll probably get the more mystical side. My other reaction is the thing that strikes me as so fascinating about this is if like you've had different inklings, I mean, people listening or either of us about what we want to connect to within this tradition, probably somebody else has come up with a similar way of thinking about it, which is kind of amazing. You have the Franciscan thing we were just talking about, and their deal is we want simplicity and humility and all these kinds of things. And then you get the Benedictine one we were just talking about. But if you want something that's a little bit more rebellious, we got that for you too,
Mm.
right? And if you can tap into a more rebellious version of Jesus, and that's what you feel connection with, somebody else felt connection with that too at some point or another, because all of these things exist.
Mm.
And it's wild to think about that, but it's true, And on some level, maybe if we want to say that that's liberating, that you can connect to a different vision of what this means, you're not on your own.
Right.
Someone else had a vision like that too. If you think about what we were talking about, human liberation from any restraint, from entrenched power, we want to like top over the economic system and make it more fair, have a society that's based on more mutual aid, respect, shared riches and wealth, equality of all people. There are people who thought that. They got inquisited,
Right.
they got wiped out, but it wasn't like they didn't read it that way. They didn't see that as being the point.
Mm.
And maybe there's something powerful in that, to know that if some vision of this resonates with you, someone else has seen it through that same lens. All right, that's what I got in the EB Nights. Maybe we'll do one more and then we'll call it a day. I think
Yeah.
the other really interesting tradition about this that you would not necessarily have heard of at all is a group called the Marcionites. And this was a big deal. It's founded by a person named Marcion. This is in 140 AD. And he's a fascinating figure in like history of Christianity, and that he set up like the first New Testament. So he's the first person who started like putting together uh, um, texts into something that we would see as similar to a gospel. Not like the one we have now, these exact texts, but he started putting together, and he's credited as a lot of times the person who invented kind of the concept of a New Testament, right? So he was sort of uh, uh, a rich person within the Roman Empire. He had financial resources. He had a vision of Christianity. He went to Rome. I think in the beginning he was trying to make even financial inroads in Rome. It's kind of a funny story because he gave a bunch of money to the churches that were starting to develop in Rome in the beginning, and then when they found out what he was actually teaching, they kicked him out
Mm.
and got rid of all the money. So what's this radical vision? Wild, but this is what Marcion says. He says that Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament, is actually an oppressive, malevolent deity and not the true God. So he takes a thread that you could follow through to its kind of logical conclusion. His take is basically that Jesus is describing a vision of divinity that is so different that actually it's just a completely different divinity.
Mm.
And so there's like, he kind of follows that line through. He reads the teachings around this, it's 140 AD, so a lot of these texts are going to be out and established. And he goes, wow, this is so different. We're not even talking about the same divinity anymore.
Mm.
And so he follows that kind of line through. And, it was a very popular version of things. So the vision there is that Jesus was sent, from the more true divinity, right, to liberate people from under the thumb of this more oppressive deity, which was the one that's more associated with like the Old Testament and kind of the idea of the vengeful God and the God that has all these demands of rules and compliance and all these things. So in this vision of Jesus as a divine figure, he's kind of a divine messenger from the more true divinity, and then he kind of shares this idea of you know there's a more true God. What you've been presented with isn't the true God. You have to break out from under the oppression of this false deity, and like that's the point of the teaching, right? It's also you get this other little bit of like interesting concept here. There's a thing called docetism, which is like the take that Jesus was never really like a human person, right? He was always sort of what you might call like an avatar, not like some blue guy in 3D. I guess he would be in 3D, but he came as a figure that was appeared to be human, but only took on human form, right? And appeared in the material world to show that no, this material world is like this flawed creation of this false divinity. That's the one that's constantly rampaging around and is such a destructive figure,
Mm.
like the Old Testament. So it's sort of, it gets to a term that we'll get to when we get to the Gnostics too, this idea that there's a demiurge, a creator divinity that is like not the true divine source. That's also somehow kind of diluted, you know, and it's Marcion's way of talking about this. To Marcion's perspective, he also saw Paul as recognizing this too. So this is the side that sort of likes Paul more, but Marcion saw Paul as like backing this interpretation that Jesus was a figure who came from the true divinity. All right, you got thoughts on that before I throw more of my 2 cents in it?
No,
What's your reaction to it? You
I'm.
don't, what do you think?
I mean, I think that this is these are obviously people who think, who thought far outside the box and who have given who have given the seeds for, I don't want to say counterculture, but counter Christianity, counter Catholic belief and practice from that time up until today. Right?
That's
These are.
interesting about it, Daniel, just this historical thing, and we can kind of talk about it as we go forward. But what I find fascinating about what you're saying there is that there wasn't like when you listen to historical historians of this tradition talk about it, there wasn't even like an orthodoxy yet at all,
No.
you know? So it wasn't even just like a reactionary movement. It's so early that everyone is like branching out into these
Mhm.
really like kind of wildly different directions of what they think this means, you
Well,
know?
this was at this time Judaism was the orthodoxy. So the Old Testament was the orthodoxy. Well, the Bible at that point, whatever you want to call it, whatever they call
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
the
Yeah,
Torah
the Old
or
Testament, the Torah, and
yeah.
yeah,
So that
yeah,
was the orthodoxy. And so this was they're gonna, there's gonna be that's a, what do you want to call it? An archetype of the human psyche is a contrarian. I don't know what the proper archetype is called for that kind of thing, but the opposite day, so
yeah, yeah.
you're gonna say, oh,
Bizarro world or something like that. Yeah.
yeah, it's like, oh, this is my God. Nope, that's not the real one. There's another one, and that one's not the real one. So this is, I think, part of human psychology, especially when you're looking at, again, we talked earlier about, understanding the shape of the container that binds us. So they're looking at it and saying, how can we poke holes in it, and based on what we see when we poke those holes, how do we explain what's coming through, what's coming out the other side? And so this to me seems like one logical explanation to say, well, that's this person came because the other one was not the right one. This is the right one.
It's interesting to me because if you talk about like 140 AD, you're talking about the other gospels are being written like if you get to so some people say like Mark's written about 70,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
people are guessing maybe Matthew's about 90. They kind of put them like 10 to 20 years apart or something. By the time you get to John, you're pretty close to when people are coming up with these beliefs too.
Yeah.
So I think the thing that's fascinating about it to me is that all of this is in the original stew. You don't even necessarily have like there's no established New Testament yet, even at this point.
No.
So you get people reading what they think that these teachings mean to them. And it's striking that you have like this take that is like, no, this is like a completely different vision of what divinity is, right? And that's
It
what this tradition is supposed to be about. We're not supposed to be under what Marcion is saying, like, and it's like the contrast is so great that he just says, no, we're not under supposed to be under a rule giving oppressive deity. That's the wrong vision of what divinity is. I think that question still resonates down to the present day, I guess, to my mind. I still
yeah.
find it to be kind of fascinating. What's the nature of divinity? What are we supposed to be under? Are we supposed to be under this rule driven, like uh demanding, potentially vengeful, potentially judgmental force, right? Or are we supposed to be under something different? And it's wild that people were picking up on that, like, in the very beginning from the time that this started. I find that kind of fascinating.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I think the other thing is that is very hard for us, and now we got to wrap. Um, the thing that is hard for us to understand, hard for me to understand, I think hard for society to understand, because things are so solid, because this religion has been here now for 2,000 years. Islam has been here for 1,600, 1,650 years. You know, Buddhism in the way that it's practiced today, 1,000 years.
Well, I mean, like Buddha's like 500 BC or something, whatever the exact dates
Right,
on
but
that.
I guess I'm
Right?
looking at like the codification where some of these texts were being written like, Shanti Devas and
Well, that would be like the Tibetan version, like
uh,
you're talking about like 1,000, but
yeah.
they have
Right, there's stuff
an
that goes way
extra
back.
1,500 years before that,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
So, these things have been here for 1,000+ years, all of these major traditions, that it's hard for us to fathom, at least it's hard for me to fathom, that there would be a person like a Muhammad, like a Buddha, like a Jesus. I'm just using traditions that have a singularity, right? That would talk about things and do things, but say things primarily that would change the beliefs of people around them. And then people who never met them or at least waited 30, 40, 100 years after they died to start writing about them. 100 years. So that'd be like somebody who was born in 1926 or somebody who died in 1926. And now we're going to start writing about them. You know, like it's just it's a very different mindset to think about in terms of historical figures, in comparison to Freud or Karl Marx or Einstein or something. You know what I mean? Like there was documentation of them while they were alive. There
Mhm.
was none of Jesus in particular, but because that's what we're talking about. But then as that moved forward, it influenced more and more people, and I think that like again, this is just me looking at society from an anthropological, an what do you call it, evo psych, evolutionary psychological perspective.
Mhm.
That because society was far more um, simple, that
Or
this
more in
was
its formative stages, right?
in its formative
There's more
stages.
formative stages. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that this was that the speech was the wave of transformation. That this is what people talked about. You heard news, but you heard things, gossip, and some town hall, which would be happening in the middle of the city, or whatever the case was. I mean, we didn't live back then, so I'm just guessing from movies and books, but that like this was the way that it ripped through towns, and it ripped through households, and it ripped through families, and there wasn't a lot of context that people had outside of their community because not many people did a ton of traveling. You know what I'm saying? Um, that this would come from, from a land far away or however, well, and whispers of a new God, whispers of a new something outside of,
Mhm.
normalcy that then now could change the way that we believe. You know what I'm saying? And so I think it's hard today because we see such fantastic things, on the movie screens and on hell on your phone, on TV. We have, such a long history really now, especially post Enlightenment, of really fantastic writers and artists and things that we have access to as normal people. I can look at art from France in 1500 if I want to. And you could look at, poets from Iran in 1300s. Back then that none of that was possible. It wasn't even possible. So our minds are so much more expanded to what's possible at this point that the influence of some guy in Indiana, let's just say, thinking of the book the
We're in
reluctant
Chicago. Yeah.
well, but
The
I'm
Book of
also
Mormon too. Yeah.
thinking
Yeah.
of the book of the Adventures of a Reluctant Messiah by
Oh,
Jonathan Bach, who also wrote Jonathan Livingston
let's see.
Seagull.
Oh, that's where you're going with it. Okay.
you know that some guy somewhere who had some vision and made his friends wine out of water because they wanted to have a party. I wouldn't even believe it. So I had a friend ask me, he's like, well, what if Jesus came back today? I was like, nobody would care. He's like, come on, bro. I said, nobody would care, nobody would know. There'd be some following of some conspiracy folks that would say that this was craziness was happening, but everybody else would brush it away because we don't hold space for those kinds of things anymore. And I think, as you, which you put very well, society in its formative years literally was waiting, holding space for this kind of thing because this was the crux of our connection to other people was through talking and through pondering what was. But now we, rightfully so, have been influenced by science and technology for so long that what's possible really is only at the fringes, even though 96% of space is unidentified. 96% is dark matter. 96%. So, but yet we still are like, dark matter, who cares? Dark matter, but it has mass. It has a gravitational field. It's something. We just can't see it. So we just, what, you know what I'm saying? So
I guess
I
it's a
think,
paradox of the possible, right? On the one hand, you were saying, well, now there's all these possibilities because we get exposure to so many more things. But on the other hand, there's a closing of possibilities from what
yes,
you're saying, because
yes,
certain ways of looking at the world, if you want to be evo-psych about it, have sort of solidified into things.
yes,
Yeah. What strikes me about it is like, again, guess I'm being kind of zen about this. I don't know if there's a real person that any of this is based on. And the more you look at it, if there was some real person, then you wouldn't have all these people. To whatever extent there was a real person, obviously what you really have is an explosion with a bunch of people with different visions.
yes,
May or be not connected to that original person. Who knows? Right?
correct.
But the thing that I find fascinating about it, I suppose, and it's something that struck me as I was prepping this a little bit, and then as we're talking today, it's even solidifying for me more, is like if you ever had the instinct of like, I think that the divine is not some oppressive demiurge, law imposing, vengeful, judgmental force. I don't believe that, right? I believe that there's another source of divinity that isn't true. And I think that the vision I have is much more of a liberator. Well, then Marcion was there for you too.
Mm-hmm,
Right at the beginning, someone had that same thought,
mm-hmm,
and maybe what this really is about, if I'm Marcion, right, is
mm-hmm,
about we're going to break ourselves out of this idea of a vengeful, oppressive, judgmental, rule-based divinity, and we're going to break out of that.
mm,
Whether that, you know, and on some level, whether or not like any of these divinities exist at all, okay, we can even leave that question to the side. It's just a different vision of what you think the universe is,
yes,
different vision of what you think divinity is. And I think that's powerful to think about.
yeah,
So, I mean, if you're listening to us and you're like, I think about like, I got my two kids and my daughter will talk with her friends. They're in their early 20s and like, well, we want to be spiritual, but we're not religious. If you poke around in it a little bit, what does that mean to them? Well, I think in part it means that they're not going to follow any of these much more sort of orthodox religions because they're not going to like resonate with them, right?
mm-hmm,
They don't, that's not what their vision of how the world works is. And if I said to them, well, do you see that that kind of way of thinking of divinity is wrong, but a way that's much more uh, compassionate, loving, whatever? If we want to associate that kind of vision of divinity with Jesus, which Marcion did, right? If that's your instinct, someone else had that instinct too,
right.
right? And they had it like going on like 1900 years ago.
Mm-hmm. A little
And
late to the
that's
party.
interesting, right?
Mm-hmm.
To me, because you see lots of different visions, if you're open to kind of thinking of it in that way. All right, thanks, Daniel. This is helpful. Hopefully other people get some benefit out of this too. I think it's very clarifying to think about. I feel more clear about it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm
All
still
right.
slightly confused, but we'll keep going.
Well, we're working on it.
That's it. That's it.
We got another episode or two.
Okay, perfect. All right, good. That's good. So make sure to tune into those. If you made it to this part in the episode, your attention span is at the top 3% of humanity forever. So, pat yourself on the back, drink some, beverages that would quench your thirst. Like, subscribe, share, hit us up, ginandtantra@gmail.com. The Gin and Tantra podcast. Leave a comment here. I'll definitely get back to you. I love to hear from people. Thank you for sharing for everybody who has so far. We've got some really personal comments, really great emails from people around these different kinds of topics. It's a sensitive topic for those, especially for people who were brought up in a religious household and definitely felt oppressed by it or felt diminished by it. These are for you. You know, these are for you. And for those who think they got it all figured out, as long as what we say doesn't bother you, then yeah, you totally do. And if it doesn't sit well with you, then maybe use the God-given ability that you have of questioning and answering to continue to ask the questions until you no longer feel like it's necessary. For Eric, this is Daniel. We'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.